Right. Well, so I'll introduce my panelists. I'm sure you're familiar with many of them. We have Rashma Anand, who is the CEO of the Hindustan Unilever Foundation. They are doing fabulous work in water conservation across the country. Then we have Amit Chandra, who's most commonly known here in India as the chairman of Bain Private Equity, but he is actually also one of India's leading philanthropists, also doing incredible work across Maharashtra in water conservation in areas like Bain, which unfortunately is known as the farmer suicide capital of India. So he will really have some stories. And finally, but not least, Mridula Ramesh. She's of the Sundaram Institute, but she is also the author of an absolutely fabulous book, which I recommend you all read, called The Climate Solution. And it looks specifically at how climate change will affect India. Now, we're here today to talk about water. It's an increasingly scarce resource. The world's water needs will rise by more than half by 2050. And few countries are as water-stressed as India. We have about 1/5 of the world's population, 3% of the fresh water supply. So it's here really that we will see the consequences of warm temperatures, poverty, and mismanagement collide with quite devastating consequences. Unfortunately, a lot of us here will have a ringside seat. But really, we're here today to specifically look at the link between water and economic risk, and to really understand how the private sector is going to be able to help us to address this problem. Reshma, maybe I can start with you. Actually no, first I'm going to start with a little lightning round for all of us, because water is such a big, scary problem. I mean, the numbers are so large, it seems very daunting. A quick question for each of you, yes or no. Is it fixable?
So I'd say yes, but there's no silver bullet and time is short.
I would say yes, but at a decentralized level.
Absolutely fixable, but we got to do it really quickly.
Okay, so we've set a positive tone for the evening. India is not the only country in the world that is water stressed. There are many countries that are water stressed, some even more so than India. In your work, Mridula, when you've looked around the world and you've looked at these examples of countries that are in a similar position, what does the good and the bad look like? I mean, India is where it is today. What are the two trajectories that it could go on?
I think all of us here know two success stories in water in the world, Israel and Singapore. And I think the key lesson that we can all take away from what underlies their success is their ability to build a market for water innovation, right? If you can do that, you can win the water game. But in India, what we've done quite successfully over the last 50 years is make sure we stamp on any possible market for water innovation. I mean, a long time ago, India had a reasonable price for a community price for water, and they had fabulous innovation. I mean, the tank systems that Amit you work on are an example of that innovation. But that's gone away. And it's helpful to understand even before we can get to where we need to go on why that happened. If you take agriculture, I think there was a set of famines that accompanied India's founding. And that set the tone for our procurement policy. And when the borewell came in and the gains from the Green Revolution started to fade, then, basically politics took over and you made power free. But then what you did is you created two types of farmers, right? You've created the rich farmers who had a free, convenient, and seemingly endless supply of water. And then you have poor farmers who look to the sky. And then you had procurement policies that basically made a non-starter of any other crop except wheat and rice and sugarcane and maybe cotton. So if you have an innovation like think drip irrigation, which would save so much water, and we say, yeah, more crop per drop, that's great to hear. But for the rich farmer, his water is free. So why would he spend drips need labor, and you have to clean the drips. It's laborious.
So which country has done that
Israel.
well?
Israel. And parts of India where they've run out of water, they've actually done it well. In our cities, India, actually I was seeing a report by WRI, the Indian cities pay one of the lowest formal prices for piped water, right? Because the popular political narrative is water should be free. So if you look at the finances of many of these people, they don't encourage innovation, right? I mean, you're not encouraging innovation at all. So what you have is Israel and Singapore, which have a high price for water, add to their GDP. Israel adds about 0.5% to its GDP. Singapore adds several $1 billion a year to its GDP because of water innovation. In India, just this year, we've lost $13 billion to floods, right? We lose several $1 billion in drought twice a decade. And these are just direct effects. And then there are knock-on effects.
And then,
Can I just add to what Mridula said? I think she painted two very good scenarios of what success.
oh, I want to know what the bad scenario
And I was
looks
just
like.
going to add to what do bad scenarios in water look like. I would paint three.
Yeah.
Think of the Syrian conflict. Think of South Sudan. We think of these as people conflicts. The origin of both of these lie in water. Mass migrations often start for natural reasons. Both these conflicts, the origins, if you talk to anthropologists and historians, actually lie in water conflicts. And the third bad scenario, unfortunately, is the country we all live in, water. If you talk to people who've actually studied the impact of what drought has had on India, you realize we've paid an extraordinary price for our water management policies. In many years, anywhere between half a point to a point of GDP has been lost to drought, often through farm loan waivers. And it's not because our farmers have been greedy. It's basically because we haven't invested in the right irrigation systems, in the right water management policies, and just had very faulty agricultural policies. Half our citizens are women. They have paid a very heavy price for the fact that they don't have access to water, and so they've actually consistently fallen behind on all the SDGs. They've paid the heaviest price for lack of access to water. This entire northern belt, which is today suffering because of haze, the entire origins of that is actually in faulty water policies. So there's actually a little bit of water in all our lives. It's not just economic, it's social, it's environmental.
And Reshma, what about industry? Where does industry, I mean, we hear a lot about farmers, but where does industry fit into this picture? I mean, I know you work for the foundation, but maybe you can just give us a little perspective.
So I think that, when you talk about water in India, it's not, you cannot ignore agriculture because 80% of water consumption in India actually comes out of agriculture. Industry accounts for 7%, domestic consumption is about 7%, right? So yes, we should, not run showers and so on and so forth, but it's also very important to understand in context where we are, right? The way industry has traditionally responded on the waterfront has been very confined within the fence. So what do you do in manufacturing? How do you ensure that your optimum use of water, you're metering water, you're recycling grey water, you're doing rainwater harvesting. But I think that the realization is that you've got to go way beyond what was good, sustainable water management in your business, and you have to look at water risk from the perspective of, if agriculture fails, what are the consequences on rural demand? If conflict is a reality, these are going to be new categories of risks that we've not looked at. And even from a point of view of the critical asset, if it goes missing, what's going to happen to consumption, of products and services that we actually take for granted? So I think that maybe till about 10 years ago, you could have been fine by saying we'll stay within our fence, we'll be responsible corporates, and we will do, responsible practices on water management. Today, you've got to go way beyond the fence and understand that this is an issue that's going to impact the country, and you will have to do something to step in.
So you're saying that actually the problem is really not coming from businesses as such, but that the business and the supply chain is going to be affected.
So supply chain is also going to be affected. So, there is a role that industry needs to be held accountable to, right? Which is in both the way water is used and it's disposed. So then, there's a fair bit of regulatory noise that's going around over there. But I think that if you look at risk only from that perspective, what we're losing sight of is the fact that it is depleting growth, right? We don't like to talk about agriculture and agriculture's contribution to GDP anymore. We don't talk about it as actually a significant sector that creates employment, albeit for very short periods now. And frankly, when we talk about growth, unless the villages grow, where are we going to meet the ambition of the kind of growth rates we want to see for the economy, or the large scale at which we want to arrive at 5 years from today? So I think that's the reason why it's really critical to stop just looking at the conventional practice of optimizing your water use per unit of product created, but actually also understand that a large consumer base is going to be struggling, and how we actually participating in solving for the crisis for them.
I mean, Amit, how would you sort of describe the link between the water crisis and the economic risk? How do you see that?
Yeah, so Una, I think the risk is very clear and tangible, right? I mean, as I was saying, if you really look at the facts that Reshma was saying, first of all, we got to realize that we've been very myopic in thinking about agriculture as some number which is in teens of our GDP, because the fact is that while it's in teens of our GDP, some number in the 50s of our population is agrarian, directly, indirectly. And therefore, reality is that our politicians are always going to respond to what's that constituency going to demand, right? And rightly so. I think, even whether it's political or non-political, you got to do the right thing for them. And data suggests, and Mridula, if you read her research, it's very evident that as climate change is becoming prevalent more and more, drought is becoming not an exception but the norm. I just did this, got my team to do this research last week. In the state of Maharashtra, most of our districts are actually seeing drought once every 2 years in the last 16 years. Now think about it, all of us in this room are salaried employees. We're used to getting a check, at the end of the month or the first day of every month. A farmer who gets impacted by drought once every 2 years, they see their income getting decimated once every 2 years. And it's not just that, they've actually borrowed money at a rate which is 2 or 3 times higher than any one of us, because farmers have the highest rate of cost of capital. And so it's not just their income getting decimated, but often their life savings getting decimated every second or third year, right? And so the politicians then have to respond to that constituency by announcing a mega loan waiver, right? We all don't necessarily have appreciation for that, but we actually all end up paying for that, right? And then that flows through entire government finances, right? That impacts cost of capital through the entire economy, right? That lands up then impacting risk-taking ability for entrepreneurs. And we don't necessarily understand exactly what is happening, but this is the reality of India for the last 50 years. This impacts GDP, it impacts growth rate, it impacts inflation. So we do not really understand what the implication of the water crisis is, but it impacts all of us in very, very tangible ways. It's not just the cost of agricultural produce, it's not just the social cost, it's not just the fact that every year 10 farmers are dying in the state of Maharashtra on a daily basis. It's actually a massive economic cost that's being borne by this country on its GDP.
So it's not just an issue that's over there.
It's not an issue over there. It's actually an economic cost. And if we actually solve that economic issue, this country would be growing at a dramatically different pace. And we need to start understanding that. And Therefore, I often ask people, we need to know who our irrigation minister is and our water minister is before knowing who our finance minister is and who our industry minister is.
And I think one of the challenges in water is the fact that it intersects with many aspects and arms of government, right? So at the end of the day, where do you actually, influence, or where do you actually look at the right kind of capital allocation that goes downstream? So you've got, multiple ministries, and somebody suggested that there are almost 40 departments that actually have some point of intersect with water, right? And I think that this realization has probably dawned with the merging of two primary ministries at least. But I think that what's also required in India is fundamental data. I don't think anyone knows how much water there is, there isn't, how much water is being used, how much water is being saved.
We just don't have enough data?
I mean, there are, but I think for a country of the scale of India, the quantum of data and the quality of data that we have is a little suspect. And I think that, when we keep talking about what industry can do, right? Let's at least get into, this is a resource and it's an asset. The first thing you should be able to do is count it, right?
But there's a reason why we don't have data, right? If you look at industries that you have invested in, how many of them actually have water reflected on either their income statement or their balance sheet? Business models in India are built on the assumption that you will have endless free water, right? So when suddenly you run into a day zero kind of situation, your businesses collapse. I mean, we were talking about power in the last panel. 40% of India's thermal capacity is in water scarce regions, right? So often industry is rounding error in overall India water consumption. But if you look at a place like Tamil Nadu and you look at Tuticorin, suddenly you see Sterlite and you see the thermal plant and you see Coca-Cola and you say, you know what, you're taking a lot of my water and you're not paying enough for it.
So, which begs another question, which is, I think the common understanding is that in India, water is free. Should it be free?
So it's a great question. I think, and I think Mridula answered this question indirectly in her opening remarks itself, which is, if you look at successful models, this is partly what they've got right. Anything, if you make free, gets treated for granted. And I think by making water free, we've done a number of things. We've got a number of things wrong in this country. A good example of this would be, if you look at the map of India and what we grow where, you will realize that today we are growing water guzzling crops in drought affected regions, right? I mean, that is absolutely illogical, right? It's also illogical that in some of these regions, for example, in the northern belt, we are not only growing water guzzling crops, but we are actually exporting them to the rest of the world.
So what are those? Just
right?
for the
those things like, water guzzling crops would be sugarcane, cotton, paddy. So imagine you're growing actually paddy in the northern belt, which historically was rarely grown in that belt. It was a millet and a corn culture. And you're actually exporting basmati rice from there to the rest of the world.
So what, you're actually exporting water?
Is you're actually exporting water. Actually also means that because that area doesn't have water, you're also exporting free power, right? So essentially you're making state electricity boards who are bankrupt already at the expense of industry, I might add, right? So you're actually raising the cost for the industry because industry is actually subsidizing the farmers. So it's theater of the absurd, right? So water efficient crops like millets, which in the West, by the way, are sold as superfoods, right? Here we feed them to cattle, okay? Which were grown in these areas are now no longer grown in these areas. Instead, we grow the worst crops which are supposed to be grown in those areas and we export them to the West. So when you really step back and think about it, it is absolutely illogical and it has been done because of our faulty agricultural policies. If we just imposed some cost of water, right, or logically some cost of power, which is effectively in India, water is equal to power for the farmer. This ridiculous behavior would actually stop.
And you, just to put that remark in context, I mean, you work with farmers in some of the most hard-hit, water-scarce parts of the state, which are amongst some of the most water-scarce parts of the country. So when you suggest that we should be charging for water, you understand what that would also mean to a farmer?
Yes, because I do understand what that means. You have to, and Mridula and I were talking about this offline. If you were to charge farmers for water / power, you would have to compensate them with better cost for they produce.
Amit, can I just jump in?
Yeah.
The richest farmers have the bore wells.
Yeah, the
it's
others
not
don't.
all the farmers that have the bore wells.
So you need to make sure the farmer cares about their net income. And you have to find a way to get the right net income. But at least if you start charging for water and power, at least the wrong crops won't be grown at the wrong place. That's the point.
So we all need to start eating superfoods like millet.
Well, I can tell you as one thing, and we've often talked about this in various forums. If India actually just started consuming more millets, and we just had a consumer-led movement, and we consumed less rice and more millets, we'd of course be all healthier. We are becoming rapidly the diabetic capital of the world. So we'd be all much healthier. And we are moving towards being the water scarcity capital of the world as well. That would also stop happening.
So healthier bodies, healthier finances.
Yes, absolutely.
For the nation.
And that's the only way farmers will start moving away from paddy towards millets.
Okay. Reshma, I'd like to bring you in. I mean, do you agree with this perspective that that water needs to have a price?
So I think there's no easy answer to this question. I think that there is a price of water, and especially if you look at, a farmer today is paying to take a bore well. He or she is paying as groundwater is receding to deepen that well. Power is not all pervasive. So if you look at UP, for example, the cost of water and fuel is about almost 15-20% of the cost of agriculture. So I think the farmers in some ways are paying for the price of water. Unfortunately, I think the poor farmers of Punjab become like these, bad boys, and we work extensively in Punjab, and I have to tell you that, the experience of sitting with Punjab's farmers is really like an out-of-body experience, because they're sitting and quoting the MS Swaminathan report, recommendations to you, and you're like, okay, there are parts of this report that I didn't know that you're informing me about. So I think that there are a lot of misconceptions about, and they say that you go around telling people that Punjab's farmers, switch on their tube wells and they go off to sleep at night. We know that we are, pumping fossil water, but you only pay us to grow rice, so that's the only thing we will grow. Our next generation is no longer here. Goodbye to farming and agriculture after we guys are gone. So I think that, in cities, in slums, people are paying for water. I think what you need for innovations to be successful, for pricing to be successful, is for distribution to be accessible. And that is a big challenge. When we talk about water for irrigation, 2/3 of the country's farmers still rely on groundwater. Our canals, reach to only 1/3 of the population, and our efficiency of canals is 1/3. We've spent a lot of money, including in Maharashtra, which is like the dam capital of India, right? So the irony of the kind of infrastructure that we've built for water and how much water actually lands, that needs to be solved for. I think that if you have distribution and access taken care of, then pricing becomes, a real self-regulatory mechanism as well. And that's a hard problem to solve for. That's like a really hard problem. Who's going to do it? Who do you do it with? And are there political incentives to actually get there? The National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme today puts in 60,000 crores, 60% of which goes into water conservation, right? Which means that for the last 12, 13 odd years of this program, we've put in a lot of money, right? one would think that the bar would have moved and it still hasn't. So I think that the pricing is perhaps an important instrument to indicate the value of a scarce resource, but I do think that we need to look at distribution and access as well. And the ones, unfortunately, who are at the front line of the water crisis don't have access. And I think as a country, we are so numb. We do a bit of a track. This country has a water crisis only in April, May and June, right? It's just reported like that, right?
Right.
The moment the first rains happen,
And election time.
And suddenly we've all forgotten that, there is an issue. Last year around this time of the year, we were traveling around Indore and I could see bags of onions everywhere. So one of our field team members said, "Qayamat aane wali hai." Last year, onion prices were 18 paise a kilo at mandis, and look at, a year later. So I think we've got a lot of, issues to solve for, because before we start talking about pricing, it's not just it's a political hot potato. I don't think that we've actually put in enough of our, heads together to figure out how we solve for distribution.
So then the question is really, what is the role that the private sector can play in contributing towards a solution? We know that industry is not a huge consumer of water. The majority of water in this country is used in agriculture. I think the global average is something like 70%, and India is somewhere 90%. Much higher in the 90s. But as you pointed out earlier, there are going to be supply side risks quite soon, if not already, for companies. And there will eventually be a risk for consumers. Currently, we're all enjoying low inflation. And then there will also be mass migration. And if we don't want to go the way of Syria, which is really like quite a horrendous way, I think we can all agree we don't want to go the way of Syria. What is the role that the three of you, when you're looking at, what can the private sector contribute? How can they make a difference?
So I think given water affects all of us, and I think now at least the good news is that when I think most of us started working in water, lots of people used to ask us why there's so many issues to work on, education, health, etc. Now, even with the PM talking about it as a major issue, I think lots of people realize that it's one of the maybe 2 or 3 biggest issues. So, I think with the elevation in the, in everybody's minds that this is a really important issue, all of us have some role to play is my sense. I think the private sector can play a role in different ways. First of all, I think we can do what we know how to do best, which is entrepreneurship, innovation. Mridula was talking about this earlier. There are lots of interesting ventures happening around water, which is, solving last mile problems, in some cases solving very interesting ways to address the problem. I think people are actually willing to pay for solutions, and we are seeing some very interesting approaches evolve. So that's one thing, where people are willing to pay for the stuff. The second is philanthropic capital. I think we have, our foundation is partnering with a bunch of others, Caring Friends, a philanthropic network out of Bombay, a number of other CSRs to run the largest water for farmer project in the state of Maharashtra. Desilted 2,500 dams and water bodies in the state. It's actually a program in partnership with the Maharashtra government. We can actually expand those. We're trying to work with with other governments in this, across India. And there are programs like that which can be designed with the support of both CSR and philanthropy to really address this issue. Because at the end of the day, as I said, importantly, if we address this issue, it actually benefits all of us. The third thing actually is, again, the private sector is very good with data, okay? All of us have a data orientation, right? If we actually put our minds to work. And again, Mridula does a lot of this. She brings a very good data orientation. I read a lot of her papers. If we can actually bring a data orientation, what's the true cost of not doing something or the cost of doing something? The other day I asked one of my team members a simple question, which is, what's the true cost of a kg of tomato?
What do you mean by true cost?
If you actually looked at the cost of water, the cost of power, the cost of fertilizer, I was shocked that the true cost of tomatoes, grown in some parts of the country is actually 300 and odd rupees a kg.
Compared to how much?
Compared to actually if you go out and buy this in the 30s, right? Now, obviously the water availability is different in different parts of the country, but you realize that if we just start applying data analytics to issues that we are data that is available to us, and just start applying all this, familiarizing ourselves with the problems that we face, we actually will come up with fresh perspectives. We make the world around us aware of all these issues. We'll start behaving differently as consumers.
So what are you proposing?
Right?
Like a water map of like a true cost of water map?
There's a cost of water map. There's also, if we were all aware of the fact that sugarcane consumes 10 times the amount of water compared to soya bean, or cotton consumes 5 times the amount of water as some other crop. I think we'd all basically behave differently as consumers or as users of things. So I think just becoming more aware as individuals will make us think differently as people. So I think those are the 3 ways I think we can act.
See, I actually think day zero that all of us are experiencing to some level now is probably one of the best things that happened to water in India.
Day zero meaning?
Day zero is the day when you run out of, day zero in Cape Town,
Yeah.
okay, means very different thing from day zero in India. Day zero in Cape Town is no municipal supply. Day zero in India means no groundwater and no municipal supply. It's a much worse kind of day zero. But in my opinion, it's the best thing that happened for water in India. Okay, and I'll tell you why. 4 or 5 years ago, when I started investing in startups in water, I went around saying, I'll write a check if you have a half decent startup. Nothing, okay? Today, in the last month, I've seen 6 to 7 startups in water. And that's purely because of day zero. It's not because of policy, it's not because of anything, it's because of a day zero where you have a very high price for water. So,
So day zero has a value, and there are now investment opportunities.
yeah,
I mean, investment that you would earn a return on.
yes, absolutely. I mean, it's angel investing, so it is risky.
So
But that's
high
the
risk,
whole
high
point
risk,
of it.
high reward.
Yeah, it is that sort of thing, and you're getting wonderful innovation here that you're seeing now. And if you look at Israel again, in Israel and Singapore, they had a universal water price, they had a meaningful water price, but they had a tiered water price, right? You don't charge the same water price to everything else. But coming to your role on companies, I think one of the best things big companies can do is actually act as a very supportive first customer for these startups, right? Israel's water economy owes so much to Mekarot, which provides a place for these startups to sit, their first introductions to their customers, gives them decent feedback, like this bore charger that I was talking about. It's essentially a robot that goes down and tries to improve borewell yields. Give orders. So what if it doesn't work? For a company, it's rounding error. So give them feedback on projects. That's something that can really help. And a point on data. In my house, single house, we have 15 water meters.
15.
15, 1-5.
How big's your house?
No, we have 4 qualities of water running. In our factory, we have 100 water meters. And when we went out and started putting these water meters 4 years ago, we didn't have too many choices. Like today you have like Wi-Fi, analytics, everything. That time we didn't have. But what that allows us to do is it makes us help very precise actions which then become non-expensive. Right? If you have very granular data, you can make very micro adjustments. And that is why data is so useful.
Rashma, do you have a wish list for the private sector?
I think the private sector is beginning to, to do a little bit, and I think I wouldn't make the distinction between CSR, philanthropic money. I think everybody's realizing that there is a there is a crying need to focus on this area. But I feel that, even beyond data, what we can do through CSR, through philanthropic money, is actually bring in a step change in our behavior towards the way we use water, right? And behavior requires many things. It requires measurement, but it also requires incentives. It also requires an enabling environment, right? So how do you do it at a consumer level? How do you do it at a unit level? How do you do it at a farm level?
So how would you, for example, propose an incentive? What would an incentive look like?
So, just as an example, in some of the areas where we're looking at farmers and helping them measure their water footprint, with the savings that they generate, we're actually underwriting that through incentives. Because we're saying that actually, why should I save water? Why should the poor farmer be told that you use too much water and you should stop, using so much? What's in it for him or for her? And so we're actually looking at the fact that, instead of states spending so much money as part of their electricity subsidies or other subsidies, is there a very clear and compelling economic case for incentives for large-scale, water saving? In India, we say we've got the problem of half. So on half our land, we grow rice, wheat, cotton, sugarcane, and we generate half the unit of food for every unit of water that anybody else would use anywhere in the world.
Not productive.
So we're unproductive, right? So therefore, the whole shift for farmers is significant, right? How do you get a farmer to actually invest in technology, right? Who's going to pay for it? So sometimes it's just these behavior shifts, and this metered or measured way of looking at a consumption footprint can make the difference. So I think that we've got to look at how we're going to just change our relationship with water, how we're going to use water judiciously. It's interesting, we were growing up as kids, in Delhi, water used to come for an hour. It used to be filled up in those big, tubs. And I don't think anybody thought we were water scarce, right? You bathed, you washed your clothes, you washed your utensils, all of that was there. So that means that we're fundamentally capable of doing measured consumption, if it comes to that. But why wait for,
Why wait for day zero?
Why wait for day zero to do that? So I think that's one. The second space is, how do you also look at data to help the government take smarter decisions, right? And this is a tricky space, right? Who's going to do that? But I think that it's best done as a collaborative effort than one person sticking out and saying, hey, I will run this report and I have something. So I think it will compel us to work together.
It's funny because you see all these, in India we have some of the best technology companies, data smart technologies, TCS, Wipro, Infosys, Tech Mahindra. It's hard to believe that, if everybody put their brains together, that's just not a problem.
It's happening already. So Andhra, for example, was recognized, for its really sophisticated water management system, and it's completely data-driven, down to lakhs of individual structures of, water that exist in the states. So the states are beginning also to make an effort, and I think that it's opening up all of these possibilities. But as Mridula alluded, we've got to create, the risk capital for many of these innovations to thrive. We recently were looking at a team that's figured out these flow meters for canals in India, right? Now imagine if you could do that for all canals in India, you would double the amount of water that's actually available, right? But how do you use, your experience of building big, strong businesses to help some of these ideas also to fruition? Otherwise, they're going to die a quick death. I think there's another aspect that we need to recognize as industry. There's an entire job economy around water and agriculture, and we're not investing in it, right? We talk about young people.
When you say job economy, what do you mean?
So young people are not interested in villages to, be farmers like their parents or whatever, right? We're all used to the fact that in our homes, if we call for a plumber, an electrician, a carpenter, somebody's going to show up. So who's the water person in a village? Who's the agriculture expert or farming expert in a village, right? And incidentally, historically, when we talk about these tank systems, there was a water manager who was deputed by the community. He or she decided how much water would actually go into the fields. The principle of equity and fairness was actually exercised, or maybe not. But you know, if I didn't like you, I could remove you and put somebody else. So I think we need to actually look at the fact that if we've got 6.5 lakh villages in India, there are a significant number of jobs for, you know, all of these water managers, these innovations, the use of, you know, the first mile, literally more than the last mile, of people who would also be able to take some of these innovations to farmers, because they're created, you know, wherever they are, but they also need, you know, a large base of consumers. And I think that we have started, as we're looking at supporting some of these, you know, investments and these ideas. But here's the thing, is our ambition as big as the problem, right? And I suspect that, you know, maybe it's early days for all of us, right? And as Amit, you know, said, why do you work in water? It's still a question that people will ask you, like, you know, I mean, we're asked as a company constantly, why do you do all of this in states where you don't have any factories, right? But I keep thinking that, you know, have we still reached the stage where our ambition on water is as big and audacious as the problem? And if we put our minds to it, we might be onto something.
Now, yeah, I will. Just 1 second. I'm just going to say, I know that this is a subject that might be of interest to many of you, and so I think we can take a couple of questions if there is interest. If there is, throw your hand up, and I'll just let Amit come to his point, and we'll open it if there are any questions.
So, Reshma made a very important point. I'm just going to build on that about, you know, water actually having some. Water has a lot of vested interests in both urban areas as well as rural economies. Not very far away from here is a ward called M ward, where actually life expectancy is, believe it or not, within the city of Mumbai in the early 40s. It's shocking actually. If you visit M ward and you talk to any of the citizens within the ward and you ask them, how do you spend your money? They'll tell you that amongst their biggest expense on a monthly basis is actually on water.
Wow.
Shocking as it seems. So even that ward actually, they don't have like.
And that's crazy. Water isn't even in the inflation basket, is it?
It's amazing, right? Yeah. So, and it's my experience in rural Maharashtra is very similar. That you know, water actually has a pretty high price for the the rural farmers as well. And interestingly, water actually has become a cottage industry for many people. And there was an interesting book written by Sunita Narayan about drought actually having become like an industry. So every time drought hits, water tankers will roll through the countryside and start supplying water to all the folks. And obviously we know who own most of these tankers. And so the question we got to really step back and ask ourselves, is it cheaper as an economy to address water as an issue, or is it better to keep bearing the cost of drought on a recurring basis? And I think all of us should logically know what the answer to that question is. I think it's obviously going to be, we can actually unleash animal spirits in this economy if we address water systematically as an issue. But there are lots of vested interests when you go and try to address water an issue, because people know that will actually make their dukaan band.
Okay, I think there's a question just here.
There are two questions that I would like to ask, one on the macro and one on the micro. The macro question is this: a lot of the water that comes to the southern countries, south of China, originates from China. And what we have been reluctant to do overall is to have sort of agreements with China, with the individual countries, on how this water should be shared. We have an agreement with Pakistan, which is probably the most generous of all the water agreements that you can think of, and it's being complied with. But China is reluctant, wanted to do on a one-to-one basis and not an universally enforceable thing.
So what's the question?
The question is, what should we do about China kind of trapping all the water there and not allowing the water to come down, and including constructing dams secretly? The micro question is this, that we have a huge coastline, we have lots of saline water, and is it possible to think of evolving technologies that can bring water at a very affordable level, the kind that you're talking about?
Okay, so on the
cross-border
salination question, I think Midula can probably take that.
I'll take a crack at, see, desalination, most of our water utility boards are like basket cases, which can't afford to raise a lot of money. So desalinated water is ridiculously expensive. So when a drought hit Israel and Syria in 2009, Israel raised its prices by I think 40%. They were able to afford desalination. Syria did not raise prices by, didn't price, so you know where Syria led. On the China, on the border water thing, the honest answer is I don't think we can control too much of what China does. Let's be very honest, okay? We can't do anything about it. But my understanding is in the Brahmaputra basin, most of the flows here come from local rainfall within the Indian thing. The problem of dams creates an entirely different problem, which is earthquakes.
Yes.
Because when you have dams, you have huge reservoirs where you have thousands, I mean, depending on the size of the reservoir, you have a large weight, and that's a seismically active thing. That's a different issue altogether. On Pakistan also, if we want to cut the Indus flows, we don't have storage facilities in India today. And we spent a lot of money actually bypassing the ability to turn off the tap. We did that in the 50s.
So, okay, so one more question, and then I'm going to have the privilege of the last one.
Can we micromanage the choice of the farmers? The northern area, if the farmers loan at a higher interest rate, where if they go for the sugar industry and the cotton industry, where the water shortage is there, but they go for that crops. If we give them the loan at a higher interest and the lower interest, where it is suitable to the general population in the country.
So can we micromanage the interest rates that are accessible to farmers based on the crops they're growing, I think was the question.
So I think even before interest rates, it's prices. The reason why farmers grow rice, wheat and sugarcane, it's because they are assured a price, right? Everything else, which is all very responsible and all of that, has absolutely no guarantee or security. And I mean, in fact, there's a fairly clear movement also towards ensuring that small farmers are secured from the cost of, from raising, debt per se. Like, why should, season after season.
Remove the skewed incentives.
And I think that somewhere one has to also look at it like, the Indian farmer faces, the wrath of God, markets, finance. I mean, who do you know in this country who faces such an enormous, breadth of risk and still continues to do it, whether it's out of adversity or lack of choice, we don't know that. But I think that our, the whole minimum support price regime, again, it's a political hot potato, but if we don't, align market incentives, farmers will continue to grow. Whatever safe for them to grow.
So I'll make two quick points. First of all, I believe farmers need a lot more income in their pockets, and we need to find a way how to do that. But the second point is, it's amazing how in trying to protect their interest, we've actually used excessive regulation, particularly MSP, to not just hurt their interest, but actually to hurt the entire issue of water security and even things like the environment. MSP has actually landed up causing this entire skewed issue of the water crisis. We've actually landed up growing water guzzling crops in drought-hit areas, and importantly, grown this entire haze crisis is nothing but growing paddy in Punjab and Haryana.
Okay, so I think, that's a really good place to wrap things up. I'm going to give my panelists one line each. You have a financial audience, a financial professional audience here. What is the one message or thing you want them to take away? And let's make it snappy because we're all hungry and thirsty.
I think we're looking at water only as a risk. And perhaps we'd be much better off if we started looking at it as an asset that will drive growth for India particularly.
There's no part of your portfolio that is not exposed to water as a risk. and that risk is only going to grow.
Yeah, I'm glad actually water has become a very important agenda item thanks to the attention this government has brought on it. It's a fixable problem, and I think if all of us, whether it's the government or the private sector, put our best minds to it, we can actually see material improvement, not just on the economy, but on all our living standards as well.
Okay, well, thank you so much. A little applause for our panel here. Thank you. I just want to say thank you all so much for joining us this evening for the first in our global series of predictions events. Please do stay and enjoy a bite to eat and a drink with us this evening. Thank you so much.